Do every time this week with the Luke Grant Show. We have a chat to the man who is Treasurer of Common Sense, Chief Economist at the MB Fund and MB Super, Leith Van Onselen. Welcome back, mate.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Bill.
The RBA takes aim at the government's overinflation. Now, this is an interesting little struggle that Dennis Shanahan was mentioning a little earlier on. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, it's very interesting. So, the Reserve Bank Governor, Michele Bullock, sort of broken from, I guess, the usual state of affairs, and she's effectively called out Australia's government, so not just the federal government, but Australia's governments for basically helping to push up inflation by driving up demand. And obviously that was, played back by Treasurer Jim Chalmers and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who refuted the suggestion. I actually agree with her on this, and I think it's really good that she's actually, stuck to her guns and has come out and said this, because the Reserve Bank of Australia's only got one tool to fight inflation. That's obviously interest rates. It's a very blunt tool. It only directly impacts roughly 1/3 of Australians who've got owner-occupier mortgages. So we're effectively smashing 1/3 of Australians to try and get inflation down on behalf of everybody, whereas the federal and state governments have obviously got multiple levers they can pull. And the reality of the situation, Bill, is that the federal government's helping to drive up inflation by running a very, very high immigration policy, which is obviously pumping demand in the housing market and sending rents through the roof and putting up a pressure on construction prices, all those sorts of things. We've also obviously got, I spoke to you previously about the East Coast gas shortage. That's been caused by, policy failure to reserve our gas, and that's driving up obviously gas and electricity prices. That's pushing up inflation across the country, as well as cost of living concerns. And then you've got, enormous spending on things like the NDIS, which is driving up demand across the economy. And in fact, in the last year, the private sector of Australia created almost zero jobs and actually shed hours, whereas the government-related areas actually experienced strong jobs growth, and that's primarily because of the NDIS. And then you obviously have the state governments pumping demand via their record big build infrastructure projects. So it's happening obviously in Sydney, New South Wales, but also where I am in Victoria. We've got this ginormous suburban rail loop, one of the worst projects I've ever seen, $200 billion it's going to cost. And they're doing it at a time when we've got obviously labour and material shortages in the building industry, and that's helping to push up inflation. So I think Michele Bullock's made a really good point, and a fellow economist, Tarek Brook, has termed the phrase burnout economy. And what he means by that is the Reserve Bank has the foot planted on the brake by interest rates, whereas state and federal governments have the foot planted on the accelerator with their spending, high immigration, etc. And that's basically, they're working at cross purposes to the Reserve Bank. We need them to work together. Otherwise, inflation's going to be higher for longer. We're going to have higher interest rates.
And that's a great expression. It's a very terrific way of explaining it, really, isn't it? And look, not all the levers that you spoke of that the federal government is pulling or not pulling are actually handouts or out-and-out payments and investments. However, I did make the point earlier, Leith, that there are so many ways when it comes to housing, for example, deregulation, so that you can actually allow the market to do its thing. There are other levers other than just giving money to people and a stimulus to business.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can do all those things. That sort of supply side economics. At the same time, I'd argue the federal government shouldn't be pumping demand so hard through, importing 550,000 renters in the past year.
That too,
which is what it did. And that obviously drove up, that's driven up rental inflation through the roof. And the reality of the situation on the housing side is that we don't have the macroeconomic conditions conducive to building a lot of homes. So obviously we've got high interest rates, but we've seen nearly 3,000 builders go broke in the last year. We've had building materials costs have risen by about 40% over the pandemic. And then at the same time, we have home builders competing with state government big build infrastructure projects, which means that that's driving labour shortages in the building industry, and even things like high energy costs. So because of this gas crisis that we've got that's driven up gas and electricity prices, firms like Brickworks, which make bricks, which are essential to going into the building industry, they're having their costs push up, which then pushes up the cost of bricks, which makes it harder to build houses. So, there's a whole bunch of factors here. But, Bill, if I could do two things, instantly to try and solve this inflation problem, one would be to cut immigration hard, and the other one would be to solve the energy crisis by reserving our gas and bringing down gas prices. And I think if you did those two things, and that's all in the government control, we would have, instantly significantly lower inflation, and it would help the RBA out.
Let's move on to the education lobby and this proposed 40% international student cap, which is kind of, it is an industry within itself, of course, and the universities have been whinging loudly this week about how this will affect our education system. But it's also related to the migration situation that you were talking about.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the biggest drivers of this massive 550,000 surge in net overseas migration in last calendar year has been this huge growth in international students. Now, Australia's international student concentration is absolutely off the charts compared to other nations. We're talking about, compared to United Kingdom, United States, Canada, etc., all other developed countries. And according to the Department of Education, we currently have 850,000 international students enrolled in Australia as of April, and that's up about 100,000 from the pre-pandemic high. And the Department of Home Affairs data on visas shows that 1 in 30 people in Australia roughly are on either a student visa or a graduate visa. And this whole notion that, so the federal government, to try and counter this, has come out with this, well, it was leaked that they were proposing to impose a 40% cap on international student enrolments. Now, even that cap would mean that Australia's concentration of students dwarfs anything else in the world. So, for example, the single most international public university in the United States is the University of Illinois. That only has 23% international students.
Wow.
That is America's most international university. Now, if you compare that to, say, to the University of Sydney, which has nearly half, just under half, the numbers in Australia are absolutely insane. And just this week, we've seen a whole bunch of reports come out. So there was two in The Guardian that reported that universities have basically been handing out prestigious degrees to international students that can't speak English. Academics have been complaining that they're not allowed to fail international students because it would harm the business. The Guardian also reported that cheating has become rife from international students because they can't speak English primarily. Local students have been forced into group assignments and effectively to do all the work. And then the ABC reported this week that economics tutorials at my alma mater, Melbourne University, have been held in Mandarin because it's so highly concentrated in international students. So I don't think this is a system that's working particularly well. I think the numbers are far too high, and any notion that 40% cap is detrimental is kind of ridiculous when you think about it, because it's who in the right minds thinks that 4 out of every 10 students going to a university should be international. And that bill means that concentrations in certain courses will be way higher again.
Leith, what are you hearing? I mean, has this been planned this way because someone saw a buck in it, or has it just evolved because people weren't paying attention? I'm talking about the level of international students and the level at which our universities and colleges and other institutions rely on them to sustain their existence.
Well, look, the reason why, a bit of both actually. So the reason why the number is so high is because Australia has handed out some of the most generous work rights and also opportunities for permanent residency in the world. And the fact of the matter is, really, the international education industry is really a migration industry.
I was just about to ask you that. It's kind of, well, I was going to say subterfuge, but let's be nice about it and say that it is just a very clever way of increasing migration. And I suppose someone might have had the right idea to do it in a way where you've got migrants who are actually educated here and are probably able to integrate better, but it's not working too well in many other ways.
No, it's not. And certainly that report from The Guardian, which, interviewed loads of academics, is testament to that. So they're effectively handing out degrees like Tic Tacs now to people who can't even speak English and don't understand the coursework, which to me tells you that the whole thing has been perverted. And, really, I think anybody with common sense would recognise that Australia should aim for a much smaller volume of very high quality students, and that the focus has gone to quantity over quality, and really we need quality over quantity. And the other myth we always hear, Bill, is that international education is Australia's third biggest export or fourth biggest export, $48 billion a year. You probably heard that figure. The reality of the situation, it's complete statistical fraud. So it is a fake number, and I'll tell you why it's fake, because the Australian Bureau of Statistics counts as an export any dollar that's spent in Australia by a student, even if most of the students that come here work in Australia. So, and international students are the only class of visa, not including tourists, whereby whose expenditure while they're in Australia is counted as an export. So, for example, if you have someone doing a vocational education and training course in a ghost college, so they're not actually doing the course, they're just here to work, and they work as an Uber driver and they fill up the car with petrol, that filling up the car with petrol is counted as an export. Whereas if you have someone on a skilled visa who's been here for 6 months who fills up the car with petrol, it's not counted as an export.
Right.
And the reason why, so effectively, we are grossly overvaluing the volume of exports. And the other thing that tells you it's not actually an export is migrant remittances. So what those are is the World Bank tracks money flows into countries and out of countries from migrants. And Australia in 2023 actually sent out around $12.5 billion Australian in migrant remittances net out of Australia. And I actually plotted those remittances against international student visa numbers, and they track one for one. So effectively, as international student numbers have gone up, the money flowing out of the country has gone up. And that to me is the opposite of an export. An export should bring money into your country. And in fact, when you actually look at the money and you follow the money is flowing out, because effectively a lot of students come here with very little. They end up taking up jobs to pay their way. All that money that they then spend while working those jobs is counted as an export when it shouldn't be. And then they send money home through remittances to support the families at home. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but we should be counting it correctly. And unfortunately, the way the ABS counts it is they count it as a $48 billion export industry when it's not.
Well, at least it's starting to come to light, all these points you're making, and hopefully that will lead to a more secure and better policy in future. We'll wait and see what happens. It could have to be a change of government to do that, but we'll see. Leith Van Onselen, thank you. We'll talk again next week.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Speak to you next time.
There he is, the Treasurer of Common Sense. We'll be back right after this. And I want to know...